This lecture will focus on the heart, its anatomy, and its overall function. Uh, this subject, this topic in general in human anatomy, tends to be one of the more challenging for students. And I feel like it's a lot because the heart seems to be a kind of a menacing organ for students to master. So hopefully we can help break down some of those issues. But nonetheless, I want you to be aware that the heart tends to be one of the more difficult areas for students to master. So the functions of the heart. It functions as the center of the cardiovascular system. So that is, it is the central pump and the only pump uh, in true singular organ form to pump and circulate blood throughout the body. It connects to blood vessels that are going to, in turn, transport the blood between the heart and the other body tissues. Now, there's a couple of almost always true statements that I kind of want to break down. So, arteries do indeed almost always carry blood high in oxygen, right? Now, there are some exceptions to that rule. The exceptions to that rule, and specifically, are the pulmonary arteries, which carry deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs for reoxygenation. So, generally speaking, and almost always true, arteries carry blood high in oxygen. However, what is always true is that arteries always carry blood away from the heart, and that's the absolute that I want you to remember. An artery is a vessel that carries blood away from the heart, and it is almost always, but not always, one that carries highly oxygenated blood. Veins, in turn, have the same kind of caveat. Veins almost always carry blood that are low in oxygen. And the exception to this rule is the pulmonary veins. This carries blood from the lungs to the heart that is newly reoxygenated, and so it is oxygen rich. Now, while veins almost always carry blood low in oxygen, they always carry blood back to the heart. So a vein is defined as a vessel that carries blood back to the heart. Now, the heart basically is two side-by-side pumps that are unified into the same organ that work independently but at the same rate. So each side works at the same rate, but they do their own tasks independently of each other. Now, one of those pumps' jobs is to pump blood from the heart to the lungs for gas exchange. So here we want to change out the CO2 in the blood that has been picked up as a metabolic waste and needs to be released from the body via exhalation. And at the same time, we also want to pick up oxygen into the blood, that is, reoxygenate the blood, so that blood can ultimately get back to the heart. The other pump is going to pump that newly reoxygenated blood out from the heart to all the body tissue. So that is to the system overall, or to all aspects of that human being for nutrient delivery. And that nutrient can be any real nutrient. Here you can think of oxygen because that's just an easy one to kind of hold on to. But we're delivering many other nutrients besides oxygen. Now, in this pump, in this system, because we don't want, in any pump, backflow tends to decrease the efficiency. It tends to decrease the efficiency of that pump, and at the same time, also drastically increases the power and workload necessary in order for that pump to do its job. Backflow is a bad thing. So backflow of blood in the heart is prevented with valves to ensure that there isn't this extra added workflow and this redundant workflow of consistently repumping the same blood that continually backflows back into the heart. By virtue of its own function, the heart develops this blood pressure through alternate cycles of contraction in its heart wall and then relaxation. So we're going to talk about that near the end of this actual lecture, but it's something to keep in mind. There are two circuits involved. This coincides with the two sides of the heart and thus the two side-by-side pumps that are working in tandem here. Now, the pulmonary circuit. Anytime you hear pulmonary, you should think lungs. The pulmonary circuit is all about getting that blood from the right side of the heart, that is the right atrium and the right ventricle, out to the actual lungs so that it can get rid of the oxygen that has been picked up from the body tissues, and at the same time replenish oxygen back into that blood so that we can return that blood back to the heart. The systemic circuit is the left side of the heart, and this side of the heart is charged with getting blood pumped out to all the body tissues. And the idea here is to get that highly oxygenated blood pumped out to all the body tissues so that we can reoxygenate those tissues and at the same time get out the other nutrients necessary to those tissues as well. And ultimately, all the blood that is pumped out through the systemic circuit will be returned to the heart via the systemic veins that carry deoxygenated blood, that is blood that's high in carbon dioxide, ultimately back to the heart so that we can restart this entire process all over again. This is a very simplified figure that's meant to show the pulmonary circuit seen here, where blood coming in to the right side of the heart is then pumped through the aorta and the ventricle. Into in the atrium and the ventricle out to the lungs for reoxygenation. So you see that blood turning from blue ultimately to red, a key indicator that that blood has been reoxygenated, and then back to the heart. That is the pulmonary circuit. Once this blood gets back to the heart, it's going to occur on the left side of the heart, ultimately the left atrium first. That is going to be pumped into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle is going to pump it out to the system. So that is the head, and then the upper portions of the torso, and then all the way down through the torso, and ultimately all the way through the feet. So the entire rest of the body system. And that is the systemic circuit. Now, a few short words about cardiac muscle tissue before we get into the actual heart. Remember that the fibers of cardiac muscle are relatively short. They're branched fibers, and they're striated. So they're very, in that way, they're actually very much like skeletal muscle. But these have one or two nuclei only, numerous mitochondria for ATP supply, and they have these junctions called intercalated discs that are specialized junctions for electrical links to the cells. And this permits the passage of impulses from one cell to the other so that fibers can contract as a single unit. Because remember, the heart sets its own initiation impulse for beating. Now, the anatomy of the heart is approximately the size of a person's, but of your specifically clenched fist. So if you clench one of your fists and look at it, that is roughly the size of your actual heart, or at least that should be at least. It is located left of the body midline, so this is the body midline. And so notice that it is just a bit more left of the body midline here. It's posterior to the sternum. This is a good thing for obvious reasons, right? That rib cage is meant to be a bony barrier to the outside world, to the heart, thank goodness. And it's located in a pocket that we call the mediastinum. So this is a pocket between the actual lungs. The lungs are not present in this view, but you would expect that the lungs would be here and here. The top of the heart, interestingly enough, the part where all the vessels, the big vessels, come out, is actually called the base, which is not something that you would expect. We often think of the base as something at the bottom of a structure. The heart is exactly the opposite. The top is called the base. So we see that base here. And then the bottom actually comes to a point. You can see this kind of curved area here that comes to a point here, roughly a point. And this is called the apex. So it's a lot like a sort of a skewed pyramid. More to the point, an upside down skewed pyramid, where you see the point now on the bottom. We call this the apex, and the top up here, what we call the base. Now, the external anatomy of the heart is something that we definitely need to understand and consider before we begin delving into the inside of the heart, because the outside of the heart gives us clues as to what side of the heart we're looking at, and that's actually a very big important point. The outside of the heart is composed of 4 hollow chambers. We see 2 smaller atria here on the base of the actual heart. Here's one atrium here. Here is a small view of the left atrium over here as well, not the entire left atrium. And 2 ventricles. This structure here forms a midline between the ventricles, so everything over here is the right ventricle of the heart, and then everything to the left over here would be the left ventricle of the heart. We see that the atria here and the rest of the heart here, in which the ventricles are found, are divided by this depression that we could easily stick our finger in had this been an actual heart, called the coronary sulcus. Coronary sulcus has another name. It's called the atrioventricular sulcus. And that's probably more appropriate, as it does divide the atria and the ventricles. Now, this structure here that I talked about, these are some vessels that run through a depression that we call the anterior interventricular sulcus. So this is the front anterior sulcus that lies between the 2 ventricles, and thus it is the anterior interventricular sulcus. And there's a posterior interventricular sulcus that also divides the left and right sides of the heart, but is visible on the backside. So these are landmarks that we can use to definitely know what side of the heart we're looking at. These sulci are going to extend inferiorly from the coronary sulcus, that is the atrioventricular sulcus, toward the heart apex. Now this is a posterior view of the heart. We can see that posterior interventricular sulcus here, with this being the right side of the heart and this being the left. And this right here is actually also the coronary sulcus, or the atrioventricular sulcus, that wraps around the back as well. Now we see 2 large arteries here, although the pulmonary trunk is actually better seen on the front of the heart, and this is not such a great view. But we do see the left and the right and left pulmonary arteries here that branch off of the pulmonary trunk, as well as the aorta here, which is going to exit the heart at the basal surface and pump blood ultimately throughout all the system of the body. Now the pulmonary trunk is going to carry blood that is oxygen low or depauperate from the right ventricle into the pulmonary circuit for reoxygenation, whereas the aorta is actually going to conduct highly oxygenated blood, or high O2 blood content, out to the systemic circuits, out to the rest of the body overall. Now, a point to keep in mind, and something that I want to kind of flip backward just to show you for a second, is that when I talk about the atrium or the ventricles, this is the hollow space inside of the heart. But when we look exterior to it, we don't see those things. And this becomes particularly important when we talk about the atria, because the atria, while being hollow spaces on the inside of the heart, are not visible on the outside. But instead, we see these flaps here or here. Very much the same way that we see these flaps on our ears, right? So these big tissuey spaces, or tissuey structures that stick off of our skull, that literally just funnel sound into our head. These are not our ears. We often call them our ears, but they're not. The ear themselves actually exists within our skull. Rather, this flap is actually called an auricle. And the same thing is true of these flappy structures on the outside of the heart. These are called auricles, and it's the actual chamber inside, if we were to cut inside of this, that is actually the atrium. Hopefully that helps dispel that confusing point. Now there are 4 chambers we find in the heart. There is a right atrium seen here, and a right ventricle seen here. There is a left ventricle seen here, and then finally a left atrium seen here. And the valves between these two are there to prevent backflow. So the tricuspid valve here is going to slam shut when pressure mounts and is great enough that it pushes this flap shut. And once these flaps are shut, it keeps blood from backflowing into the right atrium. And likewise, on the left side of the heart here, this bicuspid or mitral valve will close and slam shut in the event the pressure rises within the left ventricle, causing that to slam shut, keeping blood from being able to backflow into the left atrium, which would ultimately congest the heart. The whole point of the heart is to be a one-way flow system. You can think of the cardiovascular system in two ways. This is a closed system, which means the blood should not leak out anywhere and be lost. It is closed. That means we're constantly recirculating the same blood. The second aspect of it is important, is that it should be a one-way system. Blood flows in a one-way pathway. It does not backflow. If it backflows, you get congestion and ultimately, unfortunately, death if it becomes severe. So it should be one-way flow through this system. Now we're going to start blood. It doesn't really matter where we start in the heart. So I can start anywhere here, but we want to think in terms of blood flow. How does blood flow through the actual heart? And so it doesn't really matter where we start. We're going to start on the right side of the heart at the right atrium, just because it's a convenient spot to start. And the nice thing is that when we end up finishing this, we will come full circle on the right atrium again. So the right atrium receives blood from three basic sources. It gets it from the superior vena cava. This is going to be draining blood from the head, the upper limbs, and the superior regions of the trunk, right? Now, that blood is going to dump into the right atrium. It's going to take blood from the left vena cava, and that's going to be bringing blood back up from the lower limbs and the trunk. And then finally, it's going to be collecting blood from the actual heart wall itself, and that is through a vessel we call the coronary sinus. So all three of these vessels ultimately are going to dump into the right atrium, and they're all dumping deoxygenated blood. Now, when we were all fetuses, or when we were all a fetus, there is actually a wall between the right and left atrium, and there's a septum there that forms between the right and left atria. And when we were all children, there was actually a hole or a perforation in that septum between the left and right atria that allowed blood to pass back and forth between each side. Now, as we mature as fetuses and ultimately before we're born, that hole should actually close up and it becomes what's called the fossa ovalis. And the fossa ovalis is actually a depression where that hole used to be. Now, in some cases, when this hole doesn't close up, it's still there, and so some deoxygenated blood and some oxygenated blood are passing across to the opposite chamber, and this can cause a variety of health issues. And so it's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about this idea. Now, in almost everybody, this closes up, but not everybody, and so sometimes this hole remains. Now, once blood is pumped out of the right atrium, it must pass by the right atrioventricular valve. The right atrioventricular valve is also known as the tricuspid valve. And this is that valve meant to block backflow into the right atrium. And it separates the right atrium from the right ventricle, so it makes a nice kind of clear demarcation between these two structures. That is, the valve, has three triangular flaps. Thus the reason it is actually named the tricuspid valve. Tricusps, or three cusps, it has three triangular flaps. Now, when the right ventricle begins to contract, it actually increases pressure inside there, and the blood forces its way upward towards the actual valve. And at that time, the valve is going to slam shut from the pressure and close off the right atrium, preventing backflow into that atrium. Now, once blood is passed through there, it's passing into the right ventricle, and the right ventricle is going to receive that same deoxygenated blood from the right atrium. And the job of the right ventricle is to actually pump that blood now out to the lungs. So it's got a pretty thick wall because it's got a pretty big job there. Not a huge job in terms of distance, but an important one because it's pumping that blood out to the lungs for oxygenation. Now, the interventricular septum is a relatively thick wall that divides the right and left ventricles from one another, and again maintains that distinction between the two so there is no crossover in blood. Now, every once in a while, again, for whatever reason, in certain individuals, there is still a hole that remains there, and this hole may or may not cause any problems in that individual. They might not ever know it, but some individuals have it, some individuals live with it for their lifetime and never have any concerns or problems because of it. Now, the internal surface of each ventricle has some structures here that we need to know of. Now, trabeculae carneae, papillary muscles, chordae tendineae, these are all structures seen in both the left and the right ventricle. So I'm going to skip those here for a moment and come back to them because I want to start with the moderator band. This is a structure only seen in the right ventricle. And there's a reason for that. The moderator band, quite literally, moderates stretch seen in the right ventricle. And so if I go back a couple of slides here real quick, this band would go from the septum to the wall, one of the walls of the right ventricle. And the whole idea here, this band, as it passes across here, is that it does not allow this chamber to stretch too much larger than its typical size, because we do not want this area to stretch. The more distension we see in here, the more potential for damage, and that's not ideal, obviously. So that moderator band will actually stretch between these two walls here and moderate the stretch, moderate the ability for this chamber to stretch. Now, you'll see this very clearly when we do the heart dissection on the pig hearts. Now, coming back to these structures here, trabeculae carneae, papillary muscles, and the chordae tendineae. I'm going to go backward real quick. If you look at what looks like scarring all along the walls of these tissues here, of this chamber, that is the trabeculae carneae. I often refer to the trabeculae carneae as looking a bit like, for those of you that are horror movie fans, Freddy Krueger's face from the Nightmare on Elm Street horror series, the movies that were produced many years ago and up till actually relatively present in time, but hasn't been a new one in a while. Anyway, Freddy Krueger's character has this burned face because he was burned alive, and we don't need to go any further than that, but he was not a nice guy, right? He's a horror character in a horror movie. But his burned face, as it turns out, has kind of a scarred appearance. And those scars are seen on the outside of his face. And they actually, interestingly enough, it looks a lot like the inside of the heart here. And so this is called the trabeculae carneae. Now, I'm going to skip over here to the chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae are these tiny little thin strings that attach the valve to the heart wall. And these strings are called the chordae tendineae. And they're ropes on an anchor. And they help hold down the structure, or in this case, hold the valve so that it cannot go farther back into the right atrium and allow backflow. So what happens is that blood pushes up into this and against this valve, the valve shuts, and it stays shut at right about this area right here, this region, and does not allow the blood to go any further than right here. So it's sort of, in essence, sort of shutting the door and holding the door shut, so it doesn't go backward into the right atrium. And the structures that help it do that are kind of the anchors to the wall. And these are these structures here. They look kind of like a pillar here, or a pillar here, or another pillar here. These are called papillary muscles. And they're the muscles that help form the full anchor that hold the valve from actually prolapsing into the right atrium. Now I'm going to skip forward back to this slide here before we move on. Now, as the right ventricle contracts, the whole point of the right ventricle is to pump that blood, right ventricle being largely right here, pump that blood up through the rest of the left or the right ventricle and into the pulmonary trunk. And this is where we'll start to see, the branch off to the left and right lungs respectively. Now, to get through and into the actual pulmonary trunk, that blood must push through the pulmonary semilunar valves. Right? The pulmonary semilunar valves, we see those here, are three cusps that form basically about a half a cup. Think of like a half moon shape. That's why they're called semilunar. And as the blood is forced up into the pulmonary trunk, it blows these pulmonary semilunar valves open. Right? They're like a door, so they open one way very easily and they shut the other way. And so anyway, this way, when the blood's coming up into the pulmonary trunk, these cusps are going to open. And as the right ventricle then relaxes, blood is going to begin to run down the sides of this actual vessel. And as that happens, these cusps will begin to fill with fluid, fill with blood, and they'll close that actual valve shut, keeping any blood from actually backflowing into the actual right ventricle. Now, once that blood has been pumped into the pulmonary trunk, it's either going to take the right pulmonary artery or the left pulmonary artery to their respective lungs. Right? And the whole idea behind that is that it's going to carry deoxygenated blood to the lungs for gas exchange. So we're going to exchange out the CO2 in this blood and then reoxygenate it at the same time. Now, that was the pulmonary circuit, so we're assuming that everything went just fine with the lungs. We'll talk about those later on here. And now blood is being returned back to the heart from the lungs. And this occurs through the right and left pulmonary veins. And those veins are going to carry blood back into the left atrium. And the left atrium is where we begin this systemic circuit. Now, left atrium is going to pump that blood. It's going to contract and pump that blood through the left atrioventricular valve, otherwise known as the bicuspid valve, otherwise known as the mitral valve. So there's actually three names for this valve. Either one is perfectly fine. And it separates the left atrium from the left ventricle, very much the exact same way that the tricuspid valve separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. So, same function, just two different valves. This valve has two flaps, hence the reason it's called a bicuspid valve, because it's only got two flaps, not three. Now, oxygenated blood is going to get passed from the left atrium through that valve and into the left ventricle. And at this point, when the left ventricle then contracts, it's going to slam that bicuspid valve or the left atrioventricular valve shut, keeping any backflow occurring into the left atrium now. Now, if you do an actual cut through the heart, right, and you take a look at the thickness of the wall of the right ventricle versus the left ventricle, you'll notice that the left ventricle is far thicker. It's got far more muscle mass inside the left ventricle than the right does. And this is for a very simple reason. The right ventricle only has to pump blood several inches over to the lungs. The left ventricle has to pump blood as far away as the right and left arms or all the way down to the feet. And as a result, it's going to need a significantly higher amount of force to push that blood, to generate enough pressure to get that blood out to those areas. So because it is responsible for pumping blood out to the circuit, it has to be significantly thicker. And so you want to use this knowledge to your advantage when you're looking at the heart. Anytime you see a cross-section of the heart, you can look at the thickness of the two walls respectively. And the thinner wall, if they're both ventricles, is going to be the right ventricle. And the thicker wall is always going to be the left. Now, same structures that we talked about in the right ventricle, with the exception of the moderator band. are found in the left. The left ventricle has trabeculae carneae. They're just a bit more prominent on the left side because everything's kind of bigger on the left side. It's a lot like Texas. Papillary muscles are also here, and chordae tendineae are also here. So the same three structures we saw in the right ventricle also present in the left ventricle. The only one that's not visible here, doesn't exist at all, is the moderator band. Now, once blood is pumped, or once the left ventricle contracts and it's pumping blood out to the system, the first vessel it's going to pass into is the aorta. The aorta itself is a big, thick-walled artery, and just like the pulmonary artery, the aorta has semilunar valves as well, the aortic semilunar valves. Same in structure and everything as the pulmonary semilunar valves. And this is so blood must be forced through the aortic semilunar valves and up into the ascending aorta so that we can get blood out to the system. And again, the aortic semilunar valves are composed of three thin semilunar cusps. Now, the ascending aorta is going to continue upward, and then it's going to arch over, and that arch, which I'll show you here in a moment, is the aortic arch. And once it passes that arch, it's going to begin going downward, and that is now defined as the descending aorta. So this kind of makes sense, right? Ascending for up, arch for an actual arch, and then finally descending for going downward. And the arch itself has three branches of arteries that come off of the aorta to serve various portions of the body. And they are in order of blood flow. So it's assuming blood is passing up the ascending aorta and hitting the aortic arch. The first vessel that blood is going to hit is the brachiocephalic trunk or the brachiocephalic artery. Either one is fine. The next vessel in order is the left common carotid artery. And then finally, the last is the left subclavian artery. I'm going to go backward here real quick. So, in order now, blood's being pumped up through the ascending aorta. It begins to enter the aortic arch, and the first vessel that blood might pass into is the brachiocephalic. The next one that it might be able to pass through is the left common carotid artery. And then finally, the last one is the left subclavian. Now, blood is going to pass through one of these three, or it's going to stay in the aorta. It's not like all blood is going to go through every one of them. It's just that as this is being forced through, some blood will enter here, some blood will enter here, some blood will enter here, and the rest will all continue on through the aorta. All right, let's talk about heart wall structure. So the heart itself has a tissue around the heart called the pericardium. And the heart wall itself consists of three distinct layers: the epicardium, which is the superficial-most layer, the myocardium, every time you see myo, you should think muscle, and finally, and that's the middle layer, by the way, the muscular layer, and then finally you have the endocardium. This is the deepest most layer. It lines the actual chambers within the heart. Now, let's talk about the pericardium and the epicardium, because these are generally the same thing, and that's where this becomes a bit confusing. So, the heart has a sac around it. That sac is called the pericardial sac. Right? So, you've got a sac around the heart. Now, if you're looking at the heart, right, so you're looking at the heart, and it's got a sac around it, so you can't actually see the heart, you can just kind of see its outline within the sac, then you're looking at the parietal, or sorry, the parietal pericardium. This is the very outside of the actual sac here. So we see this is actually the fibrous pericardium, but I don't actually ask you to know that. The parietal pericardium lines that fibrous pericardium and is not actually a part of the heart, but rather a part of the sac that surrounds the heart, which is the point I'm trying to get to here. And then you can see how that tissue folds over and actually connects to the heart. And this layer here has two separate names. Both are the same structure, which makes it even more frustrating for students. It is the visceral pericardium. It's also known as the epicardium. So this tissue layer here, the one that actually lines the outside of the heart that I'm passing along right here, can either be written as the visceral pericardium or the epicardium. It's the same structure. So sorry about that in advance. It's just the nature of the beast. Now, the sac has a very important function. It's there to protect the heart. It restricts the heart movements. It prevents excessive movement of the heart. It prevents the heart from overfilling with blood. So it's got a lot of functions that are important. And it protects the heart. It's generally a protective structure. But the downside to it is that you've got all this complicated tissue around it, and you have a space between the actual heart and the sac. And the space is called the pericardial cavity. And that pericardial cavity can occasionally fill with fluid, with too much fluid. It's generally going to have some serous fluid produced in the inside of it to make sure there's no friction between the heart and the actual sac. But it can fill with too much fluid and then restrict the actual function of the heart and keep the heart from doing its job, thereby causing heart issues. So that's the pericardial sac, that's the pericardium, otherwise known as the epicardium, depending on which one we're talking about. We'll talk more about this in lab. It becomes an issue that is generally easiest to see. Okay, if you cut through the actual heart wall, you see that muscle layer, that thick muscle layer in the inside of the heart there. That is actually the myocardium. This is obviously the thickest of the three heart wall layers. For obvious reasons, we're going to have much more muscle than we are going to have a superficial or a deep layer. It's got a pretty important job. The endocardium lines the inside of the chambers, and this is basically an endothelium. This is it's an epithelium, but it lines an internal structure, so it's an endothelium. It lines an open space, so it's an epithelial tissue, and it's there to line the internal surface of the heart chambers, as well as the heart valves, right? So that's where the endothelium or the endocardium is. Now the cardiac cycle, this is a cycle, right? It's the period of time from the start of one heartbeat to the initiation of the next, right? And the chambers within the heart experience these alternating periods of either contraction or relaxation. And we've heard of these things, we just don't often think of them as that, right? So a systole, by the way, this is not pronounced systole, it's systole, is the contraction that forces blood into either another chamber or into a blood vessel. So this is contraction. A systole is a contraction. Whereas a diastole is a relaxation phase, whereby the myocardium of a particular chamber is going to relax between contraction phases, and the blood is going to passively then fill, or the chamber is going to passively then fill with blood. So we look at the cycle here, where we start with an atrial systole. And notice that the atria here are actually highlighted in blue, and we see that they're contracting. And at this time, the atrioventricular valves are open because the atrium is constricting, and the semilunar valves are closed here at this particular moment. Now, once the atrial systole is completed, the early ventricular systole begins, and this is the early stage of the ventricles contracting. So the atria are going to relax, the ventricles begin to contract, the AV valves are going to be forced shut here. So the atrioventricular valves are forced shut. We see the tricuspid here and the bicuspid here, they're both forced shut. However, the force generated by this early ventricular systole has not yet been great enough to force the semilunar valves open. So the semilunar valves, the pulmonary one here and the aortic valve here, are both still shut. Now in a late ventricular systole, atria are still relaxed. The ventricles are still contracting, except now that contraction is getting stronger. The AV valves are going to remain closed, but now the force has gotten so great that the semilunar valves are actually forced open. So we see the pulmonary semilunar valve is open here, and likewise here, the aortic semilunar valve is now open. Now, we've gone through our ventricular systole, which means we're now into our early and late ventricular diastole. Now, this is the point where both the atria and the ventricles relax. The AV valves and the semilunar valves remain closed. The atria fill passively with blood. And in the late ventricular diastole, the atria and ventricles are still relaxed. The atria is passively filling with blood, and the AV valves open. But again, semilunar valves are still closed. And that brings us back to here. The conduction system in the heart, remember the heart is autorhythmic, means it itself is responsible for generating its own heartbeat or initiating its own heartbeat. So it's got its own wiring system specific to the heart. Now, certain cardiac muscle fibers are actually specialized to be that that network of impulses, that network of muscle fibers that conduct these impulses, right? And they are the specialized cells that actually help form this heart's conduction system. So they have its own wiring, in addition to the fact that it's simply autorhythmic. So that is the fact that the heart initiates its own heartbeat. Now, the conduction system is composed of the SA node, which is the pacemaker, of the atrioventricular node, of the atrioventricular bundle, and the left and right bundle branches, and all the way down to the Purkinje fibers. So all these different structures here all compose the conduction system. And so instead of actually reading this aloud here, I'm actually just going to go through an actual picture, help show this to you as I go along here. So here's the SA node here, and it's up in the wall of the right atrium, okay? And via the internodal conduction pathway, that initial pace, the initial heartbeat initiation is going to be sent from the SA node, the sinoatrial node, to the AV node, located here in the floor of the right ventricle. And from here, that initiation impulse is going to then pass through the atrioventricular bundle that we see here. Now, this is sometimes also referred to as the bundle of His. This is the way that I learned it. This is a more traditional term. Atrioventricular bundle is a new term. It's meant to define where that structure is. There's been a change in anatomy to rename structures based upon their actual location and physicality in the body, rather than simply by naming them these traditional naming methods through, say, naming them after somebody influential in the field or whatnot. And I actually think that's a very smart move. And so, because it's easier to reason out where the atrioventricular bundle is in your head than it is to try to reason out where the bundle of His is located in your body. So this is the atrioventricular bundle, right? And so that impulse is passing down the atrioventricular bundle and then enters either the left or the right bundle branches located here in the interventricular septum. And from here, they're going to take several pathways out of the bundle branches out into what we call the Purkinje fibers. And the Purkinje fibers on both sides, so that is they serve both ventricles, are going to branch out and branch out and branch out and branch out and branch out. And the whole idea here is to get this impulse to all the cardiac muscle within the actual heart. And that's why we see that early and finally late ventricular systole, because that impulse has to sweep all the way around and then up through the entire ventricle. So the late ventricular systole is hitting all parts of the actual ventricle, and then you're getting full contractive force of the ventricle. The early ventricular systole, you're only getting a partial contraction, and because of that, you're not getting enough pressure, enough force to actually blow open the semilunar valves. Now, the heart is actually innervated by the autonomic nervous system. You'll learn later on the autonomic nervous system is the involuntary nervous system. It consists of both sympathetic and parasympathetic components. This is not abnormal, by the way. Most organs are innervated by both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic components. Again, don't expect you to know what any of that means right now. Now, this occurs largely in the autonomic centers of the brainstem, but this does not generate heartbeat, but rather simply increases or decreases the heartbeat, so it affects rate. Sympathetic innervation is going to increase the rate and force of the heart contraction, while parasympathetic innervation is going to decrease heart rate, has no effect on the force of contractions. So if sympathetic innervation is going to increase rate, it also will send impulses to increase the force of the heart contractions. Parasympathetic innervation will decrease heart rate, but there is no specific innervation to decrease the force of contractions. It's rather a halt of the sympathetic innervation that is forcing the heart, is increasing the force. So that is, let's assume that the sympathetic innervation for increasing force of heart contraction goes away. That force will naturally rescind or decrease back down to its normal level. Now, looking at circulation within the heart, we've talked a little bit about how we get blood out of the heart. Now we need to talk about how blood circulates within the heart, and this is actually very important because, and the thing that you want to remember is that the heart feeds itself first. It's a selfish organ, and it should be, because without a heart, we die. So it's got to keep itself alive so that you stay alive. And so it must feed itself first, and it must flush its vessels first. That's important. So the left and right coronary arteries are going to actually bring oxygenated blood out to the actual heart wall, right? These branch off of the ascending aorta. These are the only branches off the ascending aorta. Remember, the next branches that we see are actually in the aortic arch. And the openings for these arteries are located just, literally just superior to the aortic semilunar valve. Now, arterial flow, the way this flow is going to work within the heart, is that the left coronary artery is going to branch into the anterior interventricular artery, right? And that's going to supply the anterior surface of both ventricles and most of the interventricular septum with blood flow. The circumflex artery, circumflex, think of it as reaching around, is going to supply the left atrium and ventricle. I'll point these out here in a second. And then finally, the right coronary artery is going to supply the right side of the heart, and it's going to connect into the posterior interventricular artery. And so let's point these out real quick. So here is the left coronary artery, and so blood that's coming up through here, some of it will pass through here. Notice that this branches out into either the anterior interventricular artery, and that supplies the front of the heart with blood, as well as the interventricular septum, or it branches into the circumflex, and that reaches around, feeding both the atrium and the ventricle here. The right coronary artery here is now going to pass around the right side. It's going to feed the right side of the heart, including the atrium and the ventricle, and then pass around backwards. This is the posterior side of the heart that I'm now following, and ultimately will turn into the posterior interventricular artery on the back of the heart. Now, venous flow. Arterial flow, you don't know this yet, but remember that everything gets, as the farther away you get from the heart or the farther away you get from the main blood source, every branch artery gets smaller. So arteries start big, get smaller and smaller as they get farther away from the source. Venous flow should be the exact opposite way. Everything should start small, and all your veins should merge until you ultimately get really big right by the source. So the great, middle, and small cardiac veins are going to drain into the coronary sinus, and that will ultimately drain all that deoxygenated blood back into the right atrium. Again, we'll show you this here in a second. So here is the great cardiac vein. It's going to drain blood here from the front of the heart. And the small cardiac vein here will drain here. And then the middle cardiac vein here will all drain into this big structure here in the very back. So this is actually a vessel on the back of the heart. We're looking at the front, so that's why you're seeing this kind of ghosted view here. This coronary sinus is a big vessel in the back of the heart, located within the coronary sulcus, and that vessel will ultimately dump its blood through this opening here and into the right atrium, which is right here.